The evening sun cast a golden glow over the quiet, upscale neighborhood as Daniel Carter pulled into his driveway. A former hedge fund manager turned luxury watch collector, Daniel had spent years curating one of the rarest private collections in the country. But as he stepped out of his car, a bright red notice flapping against his front door made his stomach clench. Violation: unauthorized storage of high-value items, property confiscation. Effective immediately at the bottom, a name he had come to despise: Eleanor Hastings, HOA President. Daniel's pulse quickened. He tore the notice off and read the fine print. The HOA had entered his private storage unit without his permission while he was away on business. They had confiscated several of his prized possessions, including his Paul Newman Rolex Daytona, worth over $800,000. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he was reading. His breath grew shallow. Then his phone buzzed. An email from the HOA. All unauthorized luxury assets have been removed. If you wish to dispute this, the HOA office is open at 9 a.m. Have a nice evening. Daniel clenched his jaw. They had no idea who they were messing with. Daniel barely slept that night. He paced his home office, flipping through every HOA regulation he could find. Nowhere did it state that private property inside a secured storage unit could be confiscated. This wasn't about rules. This was a scam. At 8:59 a.m., he stormed into the HOA office. Eleanor Hastings, draped in her usual silk blouse and pearls, barely looked up from her desk. "Mr. Carter," she said, with a slow, patronizing smile, "I assume you're here about the seized assets." Daniel threw the violation notice onto her desk. "You illegally entered my property and stole my belongings." Eleanor sighed dramatically. "Stole." Oh, Daniel, such harsh words. The HOA bylaws clearly prohibit excessive high-value assets stored on residential property. We wouldn't want our neighborhood attracting the wrong kind of people. Daniel narrowed his eyes. There's no such rule. Eleanor reached into a drawer, sliding a thick binder across the desk. It was revised last month. All residents were notified. Daniel flipped through it, heart pounding. The rule was highlighted, but something was off. The page felt newer, the ink too fresh. He had a sinking feeling it had been added after the fact. Then came the final blow. Eleanor folded her hands, smiling sweetly. "Since you failed to remove the assets in time, they have been submitted for liquidation. They will be auctioned off this Saturday." His stomach dropped. "Auctioned?" "The list is public," she continued, sliding a printed sheet toward him. His eyes scanned the names. His Paul Newman Rolex, his 1950s Patek Philippe, even his late father's vintage Omega Seamaster. Rage burned in his veins. "You can't do this." Eleanor let out a soft laugh. "Oh, but I can." And then he saw it. A reflection in the glass of the HOA office window. A man outside watching him. Daniel turned. Andrew Kessler, a well-known luxury auctioneer. He was standing by his car, speaking into his phone. His eyes flickered toward Daniel, then quickly away. It clicked. This wasn't about property values. This was a business. HOA violations, illegal seizures, fast-tracked auctions to pre-selected buyers. They had been doing this for years. Eleanor smirked. "Have a nice day, Mr. Carter." Daniel didn't respond. Because he had just declared war. Daniel's hands clenched into fists as he stormed out of the HOA office. He needed proof. Something concrete to expose Eleanor's corruption before his prized watches vanished into the hands of collectors who had no idea they were buying stolen property. He had a plan. But before he could act, his phone buzzed. New email, HOA auction confirmation. Dear Mr. Carter, your items have been scheduled for liquidation at the Hastings and Kessler private auction. All sales are final. Thank you for your compliance. Daniel's blood ran cold. The auction had been moved up. It was happening in 24 hours. He sprinted to his car, flipping through his contacts. There was one person who might help. Sarah Liu, a forensic accountant, who had helped the FBI take down a fraudulent hedge fund last year. He dialed. She picked up on the first ring. Danny, been a while? I need a favor, fast. A trail of corruption. That night, Sarah dug into Hastings and Kessler auctions. What she found was worse than Daniel expected. For the past 2 years, the auction house had been selling confiscated, high-value items, almost exclusively from neighborhoods with Eleanor as HOA president. The money was being funneled into shell corporations. And the worst part? Many of the original owners never even knew their valuables were gone until it was too late. Daniel exhaled. They're laundering millions. Sarah's voice was tight. If you want to stop this, you need to go bigger than HOA complaints. You need to make this public. A new idea sparked in Daniel's mind. He needed the right kind of publicity, the kind that would send the entire operation crashing down. He knew exactly who to call. A dangerous gambit. The next morning, just hours before the auction, Daniel met David Marks, a journalist for a major financial news outlet. I'll give you a story that'll blow up in 24 hours, Daniel said, sliding a USB drive across the table. Names, transactions, auction house kickbacks, everything. David's eyes gleamed. You realize they'll come after you, right? Daniel smirked. They already have. As the sun set, Daniel parked across from the auction house, watching luxury cars pull up. Collectors, investors, high-profile buyers, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. He glanced at his phone. 1 hour until the article went live. Then, his phone buzzed again. But this time it wasn't a message. It was his home security system alert. Motion detected. Back entrance. Daniel's heart pounded as he pulled up the live feed. A masked figure was inside his house, and they were looking for something. Daniel's breath hitched as he watched the live security feed. A masked intruder, dressed in black, moved swiftly through his house. They weren't looking for valuables. They were looking for evidence. His stomach tightened. Eleanor knew. She must have figured out he was investigating, and now she was desperate. He had to move fast. Daniel slammed the car into drive, speeding through the dark streets toward his home. His mind raced. If they found his laptop, his files, everything would be gone. He pulled up just as the intruder slipped out the back door. Daniel bolted from his car. "Hey!" he shouted, sprinting across the lawn. The figure turned, locking eyes with him for half a second, then ran. Daniel chased them through the neighborhood, but they were fast. Too fast. They disappeared into a waiting car, the tires screeching as it peeled away. His pulse pounded. He turned back to his house, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door. He ran straight to his office. The filing cabinet, wide open. His laptop, gone. The USB drive with Sarah's reports, missing. A sick feeling settled in his gut. Eleanor had just wiped his evidence clean. A desperate plan. Daniel took a shaky breath. Number she hadn't won yet. She was scared, and scared people made mistakes. He grabbed his phone and dialed Sarah. They took everything, he said, voice tight. Sarah cursed. They're in full panic mode. That means they're vulnerable. Daniel's mind raced. He still had one last shot. The auction. That's where all the buyers, connections, and money would be in one place. If he could expose them publicly, Eleanor and her entire operation would come crashing down. But he needed to get inside, and he needed a distraction. Then, an idea struck him. A risky, reckless, but perfect idea. He scrolled through his contacts and dialed. The voice on the other end answered on the second ring. "Hey, it's Daniel Carter," he said quickly. "I need a favor, a big one." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "This is going to be fun." The auction begins. An hour later, Daniel stood outside Hastings and Kessler auctions, dressed in a sharp black suit. The grand hall was filled with high-profile collectors, sipping champagne, oblivious to the criminal empire they were funding. At the front, Eleanor Hastings stood near the stage, her polished smile in place as she welcomed guests. She spotted Daniel, her face flickering between surprise and amusement. "Mr. Carter," she cooed, "I didn't expect you to attend." Daniel smiled coldly. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world." Then, the doors burst open, and in stormed a team of federal agents. For the first time, Eleanor Hastings lost her composure. She stood frozen, champagne glass trembling in her manicured fingers, as federal agents flooded the auction hall. The guests, millionaires, collectors, and high-profile buyers turned in confusion as men in dark suits flashed their badges. "This auction is officially shut down." A voice boomed through the room. David Marks, the investigative journalist Daniel had tipped off, stepped forward, holding up his phone. The article was already live. On the screen, the headline gleamed, "Exclusive. Inside the HOA luxury asset seizure scam, millions in stolen goods, auctioned off under illegal HOA bylaws." The room erupted in gasps. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with satisfaction. "Eleanor, I believe you know the gentleman from the Department of Justice." A stern-looking agent in a navy suit approached her. "Mrs. Hastings, you are under investigation for fraud, grand larceny, and illegal property seizures. We have evidence of financial misconduct, forged documents, and unauthorized asset liquidations." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came out. Checkmate. A flurry of movement followed. Agents swarmed the room, confiscating ledgers, laptops, and security footage. Buyers, now realizing they had been caught in an illegal operation, backed away as if the scandal was contagious. And then there was Andrew Kessler, the auctioneer. His face had gone ghostly pale. He tried to slip toward the back exit, but two officers blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere," one of them said. Kessler turned on Eleanor. "You told me this was legal," he hissed. Eleanor's jaw clenched. "If you just keep your mouth shut, we can—" "Shut up, Eleanor," Kessler snapped. "You set me up." Daniel folded his arms, watching as their partnership crumbled in real time. Retribution, Daniel's pulse was still pounding, but he forced himself to stay cool. He walked to the display case at the front of the auction. Inside, lined up like trophies, were his watches. His Paul Newman Rolex Daytona, his Patek Philippe 1518, his father's Omega Seamaster, the one that mattered most. Daniel turned to an agent. "These belong to me, and so do a lot of other items in this room." The agent nodded. "We'll return everything to their rightful owners." Daniel exhaled. It was over. A community's victory. As Eleanor was led away in handcuffs, the crowd murmured. Some guests snuck out, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. But others, HOA victims who had lost their belongings, stepped forward. Daniel turned to see Sarah Liu smiling at him from across the room. "You actually did it," she said. Daniel smirked. I don't lose. The final blow weeks later, Eleanor's assets were frozen, her properties seized, and her name disgraced. Daniel, however, had other plans. One morning, she received a mysterious package in prison. Inside was a Rolex catalog and a note, still available at market price. D.C. Eleanor Hastings had spent years building her empire. An HOA dictatorship where fear, fines, and fraud kept homeowners in line. But that morning, as she sat in her office sipping her imported French tea, she had no idea her entire world was about to collapse. Across the neighborhood, a storm was brewing. Daniel Carter had one final card to play, and it wasn't just about exposing Eleanor. He wanted to turn the entire community against her. Because people like Eleanor didn't thrive on power alone. They thrived on silence. That silence was about to be shattered. A plan in motion. It started with a single email, subject, Urgent HOA Meeting. Tonight at 7 p.m., dear residents. It's time to discuss the truth about our HOA and where your money has really been going. Join us in the town hall for the full story. Bring your questions. Bring your neighbors. Daniel Carter. Within minutes, his inbox flooded with replies. People were ready to listen. But Daniel didn't stop there. He forwarded the message to local news stations. He made sure Sarah Liu, the forensic accountant, would be there to explain the money trail. He even invited a few former HOA victims from other neighborhoods, people who had lost their homes due to Eleanor's schemes. And then, to really seal the deal, he made a call to an old friend. The HOA meeting that changed everything. By 7 p.m., the town hall was packed. Homeowners filled every seat, their faces tense with curiosity and anger. Even the usually fearful ones, the ones Eleanor had fined into submission, were present and listening. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes late, flanked by Tom Hastings, her lawyer husband, and 2 HOA board members who looked just as nervous as she did. She took one look at the crowd, then at the news cameras, and her confidence faltered. Daniel stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. "This," he said, voice steady, "is proof that Eleanor has been stealing from all of you." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Eleanor let out a sharp laugh. "Ridiculous. The HOA funds are public record." Sarah Liu stood up. "They are," she said coolly. "Which is why we traced every dollar. The HOA has been issuing fraudulent fines, confiscating personal property, and funneling the money through shell companies." She clicked a button. A projector lit up the wall behind her, displaying bank records, transfers, and fake violations. Gasps filled the room. Then, Daniel played the final piece of evidence. A secret recording from Kessler, the corrupt auctioneer, admitting to the scam. That's when the shouting started. "You stole from us!" someone yelled. "You took my father's war medals!" cried an elderly man. "You ruined our lives!" Eleanor turned pale. For the first time, she had no way out. And then, the doors opened, and in walked the police. With Eleanor and her corrupt network dismantled, the neighborhood was finally free. But the scars of her greed remained. Over 24 families had lost priceless possessions. Some had been forced to sell their homes, and trust in the HOA system was completely shattered. Daniel knew that taking Eleanor down wasn't enough. If he wanted real change, he had to fix what she broke. So he called for a community meeting. At first, people were hesitant. For years, they had been bullied into silence, afraid that speaking out would lead to fines, threats, or worse. But as neighbors gathered in the town hall, something shifted. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had lost her late husband's collection of rare baseball cards, stepped forward. "I thought we had no power," she admitted, voice shaking. But Daniel proved we do. Mr. Patel, who had nearly lost his business due to fraudulent fines, stood next. We can't let this happen again. We need to take control. That night, the community voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. No more unnecessary fines, no more abuse of power. Instead, they formed a resident committee, a system where decisions would be made fairly and transparently. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't ruled by fear. It was ruled by the people. And just like that, Eleanor's empire crumbled completely. Months later, Daniel sat on his back porch, sipping a glass of whiskey as he watched the sunset. His Paul Newman Rolex Daytona gleamed on his wrist, a reminder of the battle he had fought and won. His phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. Eleanor just accepted a plea deal. 10 years in federal prison. Daniel smirked. Justice. But this story was never just about a watch collection. It was about power, who has it, who abuses it, and what happens when people stop questioning authority. HOAs, landlords, bosses, politicians. They all thrive on the same thing, fear. Eleanor ruled the neighborhood because people were too afraid to push back. For years, they let her get away with blatant corruption because she made them believe they were powerless. But the moment one person stood up, everything changed. This wasn't just Daniel's victory. It was a reminder to everyone. Know your rights. Never assume a rule is fair just because someone in power says it is. Document everything. Photos, emails, timestamps. Proof wins battles. Find allies. A single voice is easy to silence. A united front is unstoppable. Use public pressure. When the system fails, exposure is the greatest weapon. Daniel never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted his watches back. But sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. And that's a legacy worth more than any Rolex.